Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you with us for our Lunch and Learn session on a BA technique. We're going to hear about how to build a business case and all the elements that go into a business case and what makes a really great business case. So
Right. And I'm, go
we
ahead.
got we got our business case expert with us today. She's a real advocate for the business case and thinks every initiative should start with a business case. So Kathy
It should.
Leigh is a business analyst in Lexington, Kentucky. Works for the Boyd Corporation, Caterpillar trucks, if you didn't know, tractors. Um, and that so I'll turn it over to Kathy.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, as Aaron said, I work for Boyd and I've been writing business cases for them. And I'm actually my manager asked me to write a business case, but I still don't know exactly what it's about. So he's supposed to give me some of the details over the weekend, and then I'll be writing it next week. But anyway, so what I'll be doing here is talking about the technique and how it works, and then giving you a few examples of some business cases that I've written in the past. And in addition, in the past, before I became a business analyst and I was just a project and program manager, I didn't always, uh, it wasn't always called a business case, but that nevertheless was what it was. Sometimes it was called a capital appropriation request. It just depends on the names that your company that you work for give to it, whatever, to the document. Anyway, all right, so we'll get started here. So our agenda here is the purpose, description, and elements of the business case, and then some examples, and then questions. Although you can put questions in the chat window, and Aaron or somebody can bring them up, and I can answer them while we're doing this. We don't really have to wait till the end. So purpose and description here. So the business case is supposed to provide a justification for a particular course of action based on the benefits to be realized by using a proposed solution as compared to the cost, effort, and other considerations that you would have to acquire and maintain that solution. And I think in the BA Bach, they actually say live with that solution, but I think of it as maintain that solution. Anyway, so a business case um, is supposed to capture and explain the rationale for undertaking a change. And the business case should provide sufficient detail to inform and request approval, um, but not without providing specific intricacies. So I think I accidentally deleted the without. Sorry. You don't have to provide specific intricacies. It should be kind of at a more general level than that. So sorry about that I accidentally deleted that word. That makes all the difference, right? So the description of the business case is it will define the need, determine the desired outcomes, assess any constraints, assumptions, and risks, and recommend a solution. And sometimes a business case can be about several different solutions. But the general idea is to pick one. Okay. So, and other times it's just about one solution versus doing nothing. So, the elements of a business case start off with the need assessment. So, the need is typically a goal or objective that has been identified by someone and given to you, and it must be met. So, it can be either a current problem or it can be an opportunity that the business wants to make sure that you take advantage of, or sometimes it can be both a problem and an opportunity. And so then the desired outcomes is the next element. So the desired outcome or outcomes typically describe the future state that should result if this need is fulfilled. And you want to make sure these are measurable in order that the success of the chosen solution can be determined. So if there are multiple solutions, their ability to fulfill desired outcomes will help determine the recommended solution. So if you have to make a choice, you can base that on how well each one will fulfill desired outcomes. And that's why it needs to be measurable. And then you've got assessing alternatives because there may be multiple solutions to assess. And so during that process, you should use scope, feasibility, assumptions, risks, and constraints. And actually, I call this last one, most importantly, financial analysis and value assessment. Most of the companies that I've worked for, that was the main thing, was financial analysis and value assessment. So the recommended solution typically describes what is the perceived best way to solve the problem or take advantage of the opportunity after the completion of the assessment phase. And it needs to be described in sufficient detail so that the decision makers can understand it and determine if it should be implemented. But not too much detail because you don't want them to get bored, right? But they need to be able to, it needs to be clear so that they can understand it and they can for themselves determine if it should be implemented. Because you may think it should be implemented, but not everybody necessarily agrees with you. So then I'm going to talk about some examples. I've written quite a few business cases over the years, and they've pretty much all been about implementing some kind of technology solution. Some of them have been about increasing revenue. Some of them have been about reducing days of receivables. But some of the most interesting ones were about decreasing risk and avoiding loss of revenue, which, was one of those things that I, didn't really think about until we found some things that, identified some risks. So in a company where I worked, I was approached by some coworkers from accounts receivable, and they wanted either to try to increase revenues by giving a discount to the business-to-business customers who spent over a certain large amount per year, or decrease the days of receivables by giving our business-to-business customers more ways to pay. So they wanted to do one of those. So I after confirming the need and eliciting and confirming the requirements from them, I began working on the business case. I also discussed it with the group of workers that we called our outside sales team. And what they did was they were located in various areas in the country, and they made the business to business sales that did not occur on our business to business website, because we had a business to business website so that businesses could log on and buy things. But as I say, there were also some retail stores, but there was also an outside sales team, and in many cases they were the ones who made those sales. And then when I discussed it with them, they were very worried that the discount would negatively affect their commissions. So they were very against doing this particular thing. So I told the accounts receivable team about it, and they decided to focus on the more ways to pay proposed solution instead. So therefore, I created a business case based on more ways to pay, where we had an estimate of how much more quickly, which it definitely did do, but how much more quickly our customers would pay if we gave them additional ways to pay. Because at that point in time, they could send us checks or use credit cards or debit cards, but we also, had some technology that we could add where they could pay more easily online as opposed to, going to our business to business or to our e-commerce site. So it got approved, it got implemented, it worked very well. It did exactly what it was supposed to do, reduced our days of receivables. So, because as I'm sure you all know, days of receivables is something that the accounting teams want to be lower, right? Because they want us to make the money, and they want the money to get paid ASAP. So if anybody has any questions on that, let me know. Um, Otherwise, I'll go on to example number 2. So um, business case example number 2 happened
Quick
where
question.
one day, I'm sorry, go ahead.
What about risk assessment?
Risk assessment, we're going to talk about that here. Yeah, we'll talk about it really soon. So, and because this next business case example is about a risk, okay? So one day, the internal audit director came to my office to talk to me. And he told me that the payment card industry, which is known as PCI, had a new regulation that they were going to be implementing, with which we had to comply by December 31st or have real problems. They were doing this because so many um, so many merchants who had online sales and that sort of thing were getting hacked. And then so um, PCI had come up with several levels of compliance, and we had to implement one of them in order to keep our customers' payment information safe. And if we did not implement one of them, then we would no longer be able to accept credit or debit cards from our customers. And that would have decimated our sales by hundreds of millions of dollars. Because we were definitely a company that, sold in the billions every year. So, anyway, so we had to do something. And yeah, because otherwise, PCI would consider us too risky. And so, all right. So the internal audit director wanted us to become PCI self-assessment questionnaire A compliant. That was what it was called back then. It's probably called something different now. I'm pretty sure it is. Yeah, I forget what it's called now. But anyway, that meant that the customer payment information, whether credit card, debit card, or bank account, would never come into our systems. And this would require us to have some customizations that would, in the case of the B2B website or the B2C website, take the customer to our payment processor's website when they went to their shopping cart and started the payment process. And it would also, if we had situations where a customer was calling in to our office and having their order placed by a direct response representative, who would then put in the order into our systems. Once again, they would be taken to the payment processor's website where they would put in the customer's payment details. And so the deal was that the payment processor company had bank-like security. It was really good. We, on the other hand, as a merchant, had the least security. So we just basically took ourselves out of that whole process, because typically when you would put at that point in time, if you would buy something, it would first your information would go to the vendor, which was us, and then to the payment processor, and then to the bank, and then come back. And so, as I say, we were the most, we had the most risk and the least security, and we were the most likely to get hacked. So we took ourselves out. We wanted to take ourselves out of that. So, so it was a surprisingly easy business case to write. Because instead of creating additional revenue, we were mitigating or preventing risk of revenue loss. And so the business case got approved in record time, because nobody wanted to. I mean, essentially, if we didn't do it, if you looked at a probability and impact analysis, there was 100% probability that we weren't going to be able to accept customer payment cards. So it got, as I say, approved in record time. And even though it seemed like it was going to be a complex project to do, it turned out to be pretty easy. It went very smoothly. It was pretty quick. It was very successful. And I spoke about it at conferences and sent our cleansed design documents to anyone who wanted to do the same thing at their company. And as I say, this was at least 15 years ago. And I think it was, yeah, 2010, 2009, something like that. But anyway, we were first company in the United States who did that. So as I say, I sent cleansed design documents to a number of companies that requested them, and they sent me coffee mugs or T-shirts. So it was good. So anybody have any questions about that one?
Don't have any questions in the chat. However, Eric and Peter are citing their experiences with doing business cases, and that Eric had said that of the alternatives he had in a business case, the one he thought was best, and that should be the solution, was not the one that was selected.
Oh, sometimes that happens.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. And Peter was
And
saying he put a lot of time into putting together a business case and that, and the executive or the decision maker
mhm.
didn't like the payback period. So
Yeah,
the project never happened. And that.
yeah, right. Well, and at some places where I've worked, the return on investment had to be, um, had to be happening in less than a year and a half. In other words, they weren't going to wait 5 years to get paid back, you know. Now, in this particular case, with the payment card industry, um, your return on investment, it wasn't so much about that. It was about, you know, not losing a whole bunch of money in the next 9 months. Because, it was, as I say, we started doing it in March or April, you know, and got it done very quickly. Um, yeah. And also, in addition to that, we also uh, we also had got some software. I forgot to mention that. We got some software that would tell us that would show us where there was any payment information, um, not just where we would expect it to be, but where we might not expect it to be, like in the notes on a sales order. That's something like that, maybe where somebody had put it in. And so we used that software, and it allowed me to write a SQL query to get rid of all customer payment data. And so we did that. We didn't do it right away. We did it about 6 to 8 weeks after we had put the project into production and determined that it was working really well. We didn't want to delete all that stuff until we knew it was working really well, but it was. And we didn't actually delete it. All of the we just turned all of the account numbers and credit card numbers to zeros, you know. So
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, in both of those situations, Art and Peter are citing there, that kind of thing happens. And,
Yeah,
whether
right. It does.
you think there's a better solution, but a team or a decision maker
Hmm.
decides on a different direction,
Sure.
certainly happens in that. And not only business cases, but other pieces of our business analysis work. We could put a lot of time and effort into it, and it really doesn't get used. You just kind of get used to that kind of thing. But
Okay. Leanne has her hand up.
Yes, Catherine, I'm interested to know if you are able to talk a little, dive a little bit deeper. What's the new regulations about that impact your original process that makes your process not compliant? Is it about the cybersecurity? And the second question is, uh, how did you mitigate the risk? You mean, you're not, you change your business case from revenue income, more revenue growth into less revenue loss, minimize the
Yeah.
risk of loss.
That's what it was. Yeah. Because, and so the whole thing was that, yeah, it was about cybersecurity and basically, just as a vendor, we did not have as much security as, as the payment processors had. So we just decided, I mean, yeah, we could increase our security, but it wasn't gonna it wasn't gonna 100% keep us from being hacked. So we decided we wanted to make sure that if we got hacked, that the hackers got a bunch of zeros, nothing they could do anything with,
Mhm.
you know. So they were, essentially, um, yeah, they wouldn't have been able to get anything. And so that reduced the risk down to zero, pretty
You say
much.
new by deploying the technology like firewalls, you use the vendor. I mean the third
Oh, we
party.
had firewalls out the wazoo, but they were, as I said, the payment card industry they wanted all vendors to not get hacked. And so we decided the easiest way to be compliant would be to go the SAC-A way, the self-assessment questionnaire way, where we just don't have it. We just don't have that information. So therefore, it can never be stolen.
Okay. So you look
Um,
at alternative ways and put it in your business case
yeah,
to
we did, but we had because there were various other types of security that we could have implemented, but none of them were going to totally take us out of the picture and, and have it not be our fault, if we got hacked. So other than, like, as I said, other than just not having it. And that's why PCI was recommending that as the best one. They had a self-assessment questionnaire B, a self-assessment questionnaire C level, and and we were currently, I think, at C or D, and so we wanted to be A because they basically made it clear if you get hacked and the hackers get some of your customers' information, then you will never be able to, you won't be able to accept any, we won't let you accept any credit or debit cards ever again. So we just wanted to make sure. So yeah, we did, you're right. We did in the business case. I did mention the other self-assessment questionnaire levels, but this one it just made it, it just made it a lot easier. And it actually was less expensive than doing the other two that we were looking at, you know, doing the self-assessment questionnaire A. It was really, it was not an expensive project. I think we spent, you know, maybe 200,000. I think it was actually less, whereas the other ones probably they were going to cost us more. So shockingly, not only was it kind of the best solution, but it was actually the cheapest anyway.
Okay.
So yeah, so I'm just, in that particular case, it turned out to be, it was, as I say, it was the most thorough, and it was the one that the internal audit director wanted. Unfortunately, he got laid off. He got laid off around the time we started. And it was really too bad because it was a fabulous idea on his part, but we still did it that way. And unfortunately, I wanted his, I wanted the people that had worked for him, I wanted them to be the cheerleaders for it, 'cause he was going to be the cheerleader for it. But they just went around and said, we have to do it this way because Kathy Leigh said so. It was like,
Hey, that's a good reason.
but it worked out, They went, okay, yeah,
So,
for some reason.
Eric is asking in his scenario where a a different solution is selected than what you thought should have been
Yeah,
selected?
yeah.
What's the best way to respond to that?
Uh, that's a good question. So for me, the best way to respond is to say, you know, either say, okay, this other solution is not going to be as good because it's only going to, increase revenues by 5%, whereas what I have, what I recommended is going to increase our revenues by 20% or, something like that. So I would do that before you completely give up, you know,
So you're saying
that
have
kind of thing.
data behind your
Yes,
your
yes,
argument and that.
absolutely.
And I
Yes,
absolutely agree. I mean, if you just go to a director or, executive and say, I think this is really the better solution, this is the way we should go, and he or she says, well, I think this is the way to go, guess who's going to win?
yeah,
But if you've got data behind it,
right,
whether
right.
it's increased sales, like Kathy said, um, ROI she mentioned earlier. The payback period was Peter had mentioned.
Yeah,
Total cost of ownership. If you could
yep,
show that, and all of that should be in the business case for
right,
each of your alternatives in that, so that
yeah,
the executives or whoever's making the decision on this initiative
right,
has all the information and everything. But
right.
I
And
will
I
also say the one of the things to think is understand their viewpoint. If they select,
yeah,
alternative B, understand why they selected B. And sometimes that may have to go, and sometimes you've got to let go of um,
right,
your chosen solution and everything. The team or the executive says, sponsor or whatever says, we're going this way. You got to get on board and go that way, whether you
right,
think it's absolutely the best or not.
right. Now, sometimes, usually for me, the last thing that I will say to them is, you realize that if we go with the one you want to go with, uh, uh, you you may not get your bonus this year because I have done that because we're not necessarily we're not going to necessarily meet your goal that you were supposed to have on that you have on your performance review PowerPoint that you sent to me because I've done that before, you know.
So bring in the what's in it for them.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, because that's always, because that's the whole thing. They're getting their bonus because they helped the company, right? So the whole thing is it going to help the company enough to reach that goal, and then they get their bonus. And sometimes that's not going to be the case. So sometimes you just have to do the numbers, like you say, back it up with the data, and go say that to them, you know.
But remember, they're the final decision maker. You're not.
Oh
So you
yeah, absolutely.
gotta
It's
kind of,
yeah,
you
you
know,
got to live with it.
yeah.
Yeah, you got to
And
live with it.
you have to fall in line. You have to do the best you can in implementing the chosen solution, whether you think it's right or not.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you've got to. It is what it is, right? So
Yep.
anyway, so can I go ahead and do example three, or do we want to
Yep.
continue
I
talking? Because
don't
it
see
doesn't
anything else
matter.
in
I
the chat.
mean, I could do either way. So at a company where I used to work, we needed a human resources module, but we can never seem to get it approved. So because we didn't have HR software, the members of our HR team had to call up the HR teams in 17 other countries just to get headcounts so they could provide the number of employees who worked for the company in all the offices. And that was just one of their difficulties. So they were managing spreadsheets all the time, the HR team were. And so, and then my business cases didn't get approved because other executives didn't like the HR VP and thought that there were much more important things IT should be doing than implementing an HR system. Okay. Yeah. And yeah, they didn't like it. And they didn't like the HR VP. Um, and so therefore and the HR team had been giving me things like, if we could just put in an HR system, we would save $60,000 a year because we wouldn't have to hire in a new person to do blah 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 blah, or $70,000 a year. And that really wasn't going to cut it, right? Because putting in the HR system was going to cost 200 to 250,000 at the time. So anyway, I decided I had to look at it a different way. So I asked the members of the HR team some questions about compliance and fines. So here we are in compliance and fines again, right? And researched all of the compliance regulations for HR and how much each fine would cost per employee that we had. Basically, so I wrote a business case that discussed the cost of at the time to select, purchase, and implement an HR module. And it also discussed the cost of not implementing an HR module. I assumed that there was a 10% chance that our HR department would get audited by external auditors in the next 2 years. That was pretty conservative. It was probably a much higher chance than that. It was probably more like 25%. And I then listed the costs of our being found to not have software that forced us to be compliant and do the right thing, because that's what you would get fined for, not for actually doing the wrong thing, but for not having software that forces you to do the right thing. So then I multiplied those costs by the number of employees in our organization. So does this make sense? So this is the data and the numbers. And it made the cost of implementing an HR solution look trivial. And the calculated return on investment, the payback period, was about 3 months. So finally, or 2 to 3 months. Finally, we got, I think it was 2.7 months. Finally, we got approved after I wrote that business case. We got approved to implement an HR technical solution. So, and that was, as I say, once I wrote the business case and the other executives read it, they were like, how come you never told us this before? um, to me and the HR team. And I said, well, I didn't really know about it before. They just, and it was it was some research that we all had to do because we didn't really know, what kind of risk we were taking. We just didn't know. So we had to go look it up. So we told you once we knew. They were like, oh, okay. All right. So then they signed off on it. And we implemented it. And they even allowed us to do another HR project that had to do with performance reviews. And so, they were a little less, because we'd had a situation before where I'd been at a meeting with the HR team and the CEO where he said, it's much more important to have a good order management system than it is to have an HR system. That was the way that had been the way that the company looked at it, or at least all the executives anyway. But as I say, after that, they realized, oh, wow, it is important. So anyway, any more questions or comments? Feel free, because I think we have some time here because I only took 35 minutes to present.
I never thought that an order system and an HR system were mutually exclusive. You can't have
Right.
both.
Yeah, exactly. Well, exactly. Yeah. Right. And we did. We already had an order management system, and so it was kind of like, so because we put in an order management system, we can have an HR system, whatever. And well, the whole thing is, if you're putting in an ERP system, one of the first things you have to put in is the HR system so you can get all the employees in, so you can set up users to then go into the other modules, right? That kind of thing.
So, just a comment in there about doing nothing should be one of your alternatives in your
Oh
business.
yeah, right. And that was one for that particular business case, one of the alternatives was doing nothing. The alternative was putting in the HR system or doing nothing. And
And
so I gave them that
you know,
choice.
you could
After
do
the
a cost
assessment,
benefit analysis of and show the negative impact to the organization
Yeah.
not
Oh,
having
I did.
HR system.
Yeah. And it was millions of dollars,
Wow.
even with the 10% probability. It was still millions of dollars.
Do you have a
Yeah.
question, Leanne?
I mean, you mentioned about accepting the risk, right? Doing nothing.
Huh? Right.
You mean, say one of the alternatives can be doing nothing,
Yes.
which
Right.
we accept the risk. But the risk assessment has to be done,
Yeah.
and considering doing nothing is an option too. And then we look at the risk value to see whether that value, residual value, and we think that we can accept it because even the risk might exceed, might happen, and it won't incur the business impact that to be in a very serious
Well,
level.
yeah. Yeah. So I did quantitative risk analysis for
Qualification.
that particular business case and others. And in this particular situation, I did the quantitative analysis practice that's called probability and impact analysis. And that's what I did. So yeah, so that was for the option of doing nothing. And as I say, it far outweighed the cost of doing the proposed project of implementing HR in that particular, an HR system in that particular case. It was millions of dollars. So because we had a few thousand employees and uh some of those fines were $1,000 per employee. Some of them were $200 per employee. It just depended. We had to, there were several of them, so we had to add them all up. It was a lot of money compared to, as I say, just spending a couple of $100,000.
So, Catherine, when you did your risk assessment, you did it for the business level, operational level, right?
Yeah, it was
And
it was for yeah, it was basically for it basically was all about the number of employees and what because the fines in most cases, or pretty much in all cases, those human resource human resources non-compliance fines were all about not having software that forced the company to do the right thing. It didn't matter that much whether you were actually doing the right thing or not if you did not have software that made you do the right thing.
I have a question.
Mhm.
What what equation did you use to determine the cost of that 10% probability? What did you just do simple 10% times what that cost would be? Or
Yeah,
how do you determine
that's what I
it?
did. That's what I did. I took the number of employees that we had in 17 countries, and I multiplied them times the compliance fines, and I probably didn't even get all the compliance fines. I just got like two or three, which was bad enough, right? And so I multiplied that times the number of employees and then multiplied it times 10%. And it was still, like I said, it was something like $7 million. I can't remember.
Is there
Maybe
a
it was
reason you
seven.
used 10% instead of as a lower value instead of the 25% that you truly believed it was?
Because I did that just so that they would see how conservative I was being with it. You know,
Yeah, so even
I
at the
wanted I
lower
wanted to I wanted to make sure that that I was, because it was such a huge amount anyway. So it really didn't matter. If I'd done 5%, it still would have been millions of dollars, you know.
Yeah.
Um, but I just, and of course, when they looked at it, they went, oh, I'm sure it's going to, I'm sure we're going to get, uh, I think we have a higher percentage chance of being, of being, um, having an audit in the next few years, And I said, well, yeah, but I just went ahead and, doggone well that it's at least 10%, So I just made it as low as I could just to show still, even with that low percentage chance, it was still a lot of money.
Makes sense. Thank you.
It was probably more like, yeah, like I said, 25 or 30%. But you never know when the auditors are going to show up, right? You just know they're going to do it sometime.
So the question in the chat is, did you get PeopleSoft HR?
No, no, we did not. We just implemented AX HR. At the time it was AX. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Part of the Dynamics.
right. So there is, yeah. If you get D365, it definitely also has an HR module in it, just like AX had an HR module in it.
Okay.
So yeah. And so yeah, and actually the company where I work now, they're gonna upgrade to D365, it looks like. Finally,
Finally, did you
yeah.
do a business case on that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I will end up having to do one, yes. And that's okay. I can do it, just to formally get approval for it. But it'll be and it'll be interesting, because there's some weird things that, I I just wonder about, So because like there's things where they have trouble uh with um, sending sales data to and from the dynamic CRM. And I'm like, how come you don't have the CRM module that's in AX? And then you could have been using the business connector all this time, that Microsoft had with AX, which I mean, it's not supported anymore. And, like I said, they haven't upgraded their system in like 11 years, right? So I don't know. But anyway, so who knows?
All right. So any other questions? Do you have any questions for Kathy? Don't
Yeah,
see
we might
hands, don't see anything in the chat.
people might be able to get back to finishing their lunch.
Might get it done before they got to go back to work, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, that would be great, right?
All right. So, what you learned today was about, you should do a business case that kind of, for any initiative that is going to be undertaken by the business, or within the enterprise and that. And it is justification for funding that initiative and building a solution to it. And kind of guides the decision makers, whoever they may be, on what their alternatives are, and you make a recommendation. You should have a recommended solution in there, and based on the data, some of that data that we talked about, ROI or payback period, total cost of ownership, any of those, increase sales, reduce headcount, whatever, saving money or increasing revenue. So that's the purpose of the business case. And every initiative really should start with one. Otherwise, your executives are making, a gut feeling decision on the direction to go. But
Without the data. Yeah.
without data, very right. So, having the data and having good decisions, informed decisions, that's what business analysis is all about, is informing decisions within the enterprise. So this is one of the big ways that we do that. Any last minute questions? Did you like the presentation? Was it good? Did you learn something today?
Hopefully it wasn't too boring.
Got applause and a heart.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
That's nice.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all for joining us today. I am interested in risk assessment, business impact, and operational one. The formula you used, Catherine, those parts besides compliance fines. Okay.
Uh-huh.
So
Well, I mean, sometimes it's just a straight and easier than kind of the ones that I showed. But sometimes you have to be very creative with a business case.
not too creative in that. So
Right. But I mean, the reason why mine were the way they were was because I tried in the past something else that was and it got, it got not approved, So
I say not too creative, because you've heard that story
yeah.
about CEO who was hiring CFO. So he asked one candidate, your revenue is $1 million, your expenses are $500,000. What is your gross profit? And the candidate that won the job said, "What would you like it to be?" Uh,
There
so
you go.
don't get too creative.
Right. Exactly.
Um, so thank you everyone for being here. We hope you got a lot out of this. Another BA tool you could hang in your toolkit. Thank you, Kathy, for a great presentation. Enjoyed it. Learned from it and everything. So everyone, thank you and have a great rest of your day and rest of your week. Where's the applause?
Bye.
We need to have one of those applause
That's all right.
things.
Thank you all for joining. We appreciate it.